Ritual is to the soul as food and drink is to the body. It nourishes us. It nourishes parts of us that other things do not nourish. That is the first and foundational aspect of a ritual, that is the component that is often forgotten in these diluted conversations where people talk about your ritual being a cup of coffee, not unless it invokes the soul. A ritual has this element of being a container for emotion and reflection and transition. And that container is deliberately designed to have a very clear delineation outside of, but related to, regular life.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. We tend to use the word ritual to talk about everyday things. We use the word ritual to mean routine, like we have our ritualistic cup of coffee in the morning. But rituals are more than just repetitive actions. Rituals carry meaning, emotion, and connection. As a professional ritual designer, Tiu De Haan has created rituals in countless forms, like when she took on the heavy task of designing a ritual to unite the families of organ donors with organ recipients, or designing another ritual to help an adult reach peace with the death of his own twin brother who died at birth. When I met Tiu at the World Experience Design Summit, where we were both speaking, I immediately knew that I wanted to have her on the show to talk about all the opportunities we miss to incorporate ritual into work. She graciously agreed to be interviewed on the spot. Tiu is a workshop facilitator, inspirational speaker, consultant, curator, and ritual designer. She's been creating and facilitating experiential workshops for almost 2 decades, working with clients like Google, Nike, the Ministry of Justice, Bank of America, and the BBC. To celebrate the 100th episode of Work for Humans, I'm going to be bringing back a few listener favorites from the first year of the show and shows that changed the course of the podcast. This conversation with Tiu is one such episode. In this episode, Tiu and I talk about the components of an effective ritual, how to design one, and the relationship between ritual, habit, routine, and creativity. We also discuss smaller rituals that we can incorporate at work, such as team-building rituals, the role of ritual keepers in the workplace, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy Work for Humans, show your support by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Tiu De Haan. Tiu De Haan, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you, Dart. It is a joy.
We're here at the World Experience Organization event in London right now. And there's just an incredible number of people who are creating experiences in completely different media. There are people here who are doing audio pairings with food. I mean, there's an incredible variety. There are Disney designers here. And so when we talk about the design of work, this is one of the places where I come to find people who are doing just incredible different kinds of design. And you spoke yesterday and you talked about ritual design and the design of ritual. And so that's what I want to talk to you about, because I really believe that in the workplace, we're missing out on an incredible amount of the kinds of things that rituals do to our hearts and minds. And so what's the background behind ritual design? How did you arrive at it?
There's 2 ways of answering that question. One is obtuse and annoying, but I'm just going to chuck it at you, which is an entire life's worth of personal experiences that led me to seek more meaning and led me to choose an unusual path through the world that doesn't necessarily equate to anybody's job description or career idea of success. Because for me, a lot of experiences of early loss and death led me to want to live the most meaningful life that I could possibly lead personally. And then through that, to allow the discoveries that I made along the way to inform what I shared with others, to allow them to do the same. So the first thing is, there is no simple answer. It's unfortunately a really annoying weaving of every possible thread of my own personal and professional life. That's one answer. We'll have to just kick back and have a long old chat, maybe not on a podcast. The other answer is, I have always been interested in the sacred. I have always been interested in wonder I have always been driven by the artistic imagination. And when you combine those things in an experience, a lived experience, ritual is the one form that is big enough and rich enough and deep enough to contain that level of complexity, awe, and meaning. And in terms of the word, I actually only really started using it comparatively recently. The word ritual has often got weird connotations and it's often misunderstood, misused as well. So I often have to start everything by explaining what a ritual is and isn't in order to make sure people don't think I'm just leaping about in a kaftan, adorning myself with rose petals. Nothing wrong with that. And occasionally obviously I own a kaftan, but the woo end of the spectrum is not where my work lies, nor is it the, to me, diluted use of the word ritual, which is just pertaining to habit and routine, which is the most common use of it in our world. Your morning coffee is a ritual, which is not the case. So an obtuse answer, annoyingly followed by a vague answer, is to come around to the fact saying, my own path to this came out of personal experience that led me at a certain point into working with parents and kids. I had a not-for-profit that was about creating experiences that allowed parents to connect to the heart to their children and to play in nature with their kids. And actually what I realized was that was an experience design process. I practiced that for many years. And then out of that, I realized what I do is applicable in all sorts of different ways.
What's the relationship between ritual and creativity?
The ritual for creativity is something that artists have always employed when they need to step out of the mundane and into an awareness of inspiration. Inspiration is elusive. The muse is a fickle mistress. Like, you never quite know when that great idea is going to show up. And if it does, how you're going to keep it there long enough to commit it to paper or to a business plan or to a canvas or to a piece of sheet music or whatever the mediums were. So many artists through the centuries have created their own ways of invoking that inspiration. And even though they have to be individuated, they have to be suited to the person's, for example, the time of day that they like to work in, whether they're solitary or whether they're in a crowd, whether they're committing something to paper or to a piano or whatever. There's all sorts of variables that need to be addressed, but the relationship between creativity and ritual is a state change, a shift of consciousness that allows you to go from mundane concerns into something where you are invoking a bigger idea, where you're becoming potentially a conduit for creative energy, for the work to happen through you and with you. And that doesn't happen when you've got 25 tabs open and you're in the middle of 35 emails and you've got your next meeting in 5 minutes and you're doing all of the things that we all do all the time because life. The magic happens often when you are not in that zone. And therefore, a ritual allows a deliberate step change into a different kind of reality. It allows you to cross a threshold, which can invoke creative inspiration. Now, one of the things I do with people is I help them to figure out their own rituals because one size does not fit all. But creativity, to me, is when we are most in flow with ideas that come through us as collaborative beings rather than it being all on our shoulders. And so to create the space where you're open, where your imagination is awake, where you can also sometimes connect with that part of you that was once 7 years old, where your synaptic pathways were firing off at all angles, where you had ideas and a free space in your mind, that kind of space becomes calcified and slows down the more that we become rigid and routine-based. When you break open the parameters around your work to be able to welcome in something other, that other can usher in genuine creative ideas.
What are the components of a ritual? What are the parts, the pieces? One of the things I got sort of schooled on interviewing Alex Komorowski recently was I was trying to define words. He says, look past the words, essentially. We get hung up on definitions and things like that. But for you, what are the components of a really effective and good ritual?
One of my teachers was a woman called Sobonfu Some, and she was the keeper of the ritual of the Dagara tribe of West Africa. And she said to me, ritual is to the soul as food and drink is to the body. It nourishes us. It nourishes parts of us that other things do not nourish. So for me, that is the first and foundational aspect of a ritual that is the component that is often forgotten in these diluted conversations where people talk about your ritual being a cup of coffee, not unless it invokes the soul or nourishes the soul. Don't know what you're putting in your coffee. Maybe it does. I mean, I'm not going to judge, but the idea that there is a soulful level to this and that the container of the moment around that connection is deliberately designed to have a very clear delineation outside of, but related to, regular life. So there's a metaphor I use, which I'm just going to use because it's helpful. So you imagine that you are in an art gallery and you see a picture on the wall, and the frame around the picture shows you that the contents of the frame are worthy of your special attention, and that the outside the frame is just general wall. Okay. So imagine that the wall is regular life and the framed picture is the ritual. There is a difference. It is distinct. It is delineated. It has a clear and firm beginning and a clear and firm end. And the contents have been deliberately created. So imagine you take that frame off the wall and you make it invisible and you make it amorphous and you fill it with the emotion that you need to engage with the words, the silence, the music, the tastes, all the sensory aspects that would go into your ritual design, and you give it meaning and you give it a beginning and an end and you allow it to usher in some form of transformation. So all rituals tend to be the point at which you shift from one state to another. Real rituals have at heart an element of transformation within them. So with a wedding, for example, you go from being two people in a committed relationship to being bonded in the eyes of the law, perhaps, and the people who are present, to being one unit. You become different. You are bound together by the words that you say, and you leave as a family. You entered as two people in love and you leave as a thing, a unit. A funeral is the last time that the community get to be in the same space as the body of the person who has died. So it's the transition into releasing the physical form of the person who has died and focusing on the memories and the gifts of that person or the loss or whatever it is, and then releasing that body which they're never going to engage in again. All of these rituals are fundamental to human culture. They have been around as long as we have been around. So a ritual has this element of being a container for emotion and reflection and transition, and sometimes celebration, not always. And it needs to invoke something bigger than ourselves. If it's a ritual for work, it needs to invoke inspiration or connection or maybe completion or something bigger. If it's a ritual for love, it needs to engage the heart. It needs to make people cry. Basically, I like a ritual to make people cry, if at all possible. Just one other aspect to this, it also often contains 3 stages. The first stage of a ritual is separation from the status quo, from the norm, where you step out of one reality into another. The second stage is transformation, which is the liminality in the middle of it. And then the third stage is reincorporation, going back into the world, having harvested the gifts of the transformed bit in the middle. So those are some of the components.
Can you describe some of the rituals, the bespoke rituals that you have developed for people?
I absolutely can. Okay, so I'm going to give an example of one which was a guy who saw me speak, and he came up to me after a talk and he said, I have a very unusual situation. I think I need your help. When I was born, I had a stillborn twin brother. And my stillborn twin brother was never spoken about by the family other than he was given a name. But beyond that, it was never discussed. And this guy said that through his life, he was very aware of the fact that he had survived when his brother had not. He felt guilt around this. He also felt later in life, he had suffered from depression. And there were points where he actually was close to suicide and he held back because of his brother. His brother had died and he had lived, and therefore he felt honor bound to stay alive because in his mind, his brother had sacrificed his life for him. And he said, this is something that I need to honor and mark in some way. Can you help me? And I said, why, yes, I can. So we went through a ritual design process and we ended up with 2 iterations. The first one was very simple. He just wanted to have a birthday party for his brother, which was going to be all the childhood birthday parties his brother had never had. It was going to be jelly and ice cream, balloons and a fairground and all that stuff. But then it evolved into something deeper. And the thing he ended up designing with me was a year-long pilgrimage where every month he would take a weekend and he would go to visit a place that was important in his life story, including the childhood playground where he lived when he was a kid in a different country, and right the way through to different chapters of his life where he went to university, his first job, the site of meeting his first girlfriend, various different places that were important to him. And in each one, he would create a different ritual that would take 5 minutes, no more, that would invite the spirit of his brother to be present at this part of the story, including he had a very depressing chapter in a town called Bedford, which is a pretty depressing town. And his ritual there was to go to a pub, drink a pint of bad beer, and then take a piss on Bedford. That was his ritual. At each point of this journey, he was going to somehow document the stage of life. He was going to take a photograph or draw something or write about it and put together a talk and a book. And he was going to show his parents at the end of the year. So the process of facing into that allowed him to honor his brother and to go through his own journey, which he gave a talk, which was very moving and powerful, which I witnessed. I don't know if he did the whole journey because in a way, the design in itself had so much power to it and healing that I feel like maybe it was enough. That's one example. It's quite an intense one.
Could you describe the work you did with a team of physicists? Because we can start to move this closer and closer to how it relates to work.
A few years ago, I met a guy who, his name's Jeremy O'Brien. He is a quantum physicist. He's now CEO of a quantum computing company in Silicon Valley called PsiQuantum. When I met him, he was just on his way to Silicon Valley, and he was leaving behind the university department that he had set up in Bristol University in the UK, which was called the Center for Quantum Photonics. And it's a world-leading university department of quantum physicists who are all making the component parts for basically the world's first readily available quantum computer. And he is a lunatic in the best possible way. He's actually an artist as well as an entrepreneur and a physicist. And he is constantly chucking people in at the deep end and making them do things that are outside of their comfort zone. And he was worried that in his absence, the people who were in the university would get a little bit sluggish and linear in their thinking. And he said, can I please get you to come in and help me help them to think the unthinkable? That was my official brief. And I was like, yes, okay. Are there any limits? And he said, none at all. We just need to get you past HR. So I then came back with a year-long program of what I thought were absolutely insane suggestions. He was absolutely fine with all of them. He had no problem. But the very first day, it started with, to me, this is not insane, started with taking everybody to the forest and taking them through a process, which is what I call a magic portal walk, which is where you learn how to find magic portals into other worlds. I am not exaggerating. It's literally a process that allows you to do that, which is a very powerful way to radically open your imagination. So the day before I went for the first time, this guy had a department meeting and everybody showed up and he said, there's this woman coming tomorrow and I don't know what she's going to do with you. I think she's going to make you go to the forest, take all your clothes off and take LSD. And I strongly suggest that you attend. So that was what I was living into. I did not, just to be absolutely clear, no drugs are taken on my watch ever. And everybody kept all their clothes on. But I did take them to the forest and there was a full turnout. They were all there. And it did work. So I took all these guys who are normally lab-dwelling super brains into nature and gave them a technique which allowed them to step completely into a different kind of awareness and a way of welcoming in an imaginative relationship with nature and with themselves, and with a way of coming back and connecting with each other that shifted their perception. I then had a year with these guys where I was basically allowed to make anything up, and we had fantastic adventures. Just before COVID, I iterated a pilot, and now I'm doing it again. It's like the stuff I did with the quantum physicists, but it's for 6 people, regular people. Actually, they're not regular people, they're extraordinary people, but they're not quantum physicists, to go through a year-long process with me. And the way it works is 6 people. It happens to be women this year. There's no reason why that is the case. They just naturally coalesced, and they are women. Go through 6 one-day experiences with me over the course of the year, including taking them to the forest and teaching them how to find magic portals into other worlds, including a ritual design workshop so that they can each design their own rituals, including taking people on random acts of kindness and beauty in the city, and various other things. And in addition to that, we have one full residential weekend together in a beautiful place in the countryside, where, amongst other things, we're going to have a dinner for the dead, where each person is going to bring a beloved dead person, and we're going to have dinner together with them. And everybody gets 12 hours one-to-one with me over the course of the year. First of all, I've never done anything that's so much joy. It's just the culmination of everything. But the thing that's so extraordinary is the women who happen to be on this path with me are all bridges in the world between really seriously powerful careers and fully open-hearted, personal, emotional, spiritual openness. And that is the piece that I am finding most interesting. So amongst this 6, we have a senior surgeon who works with children, reconstructing children who have damaged faces and skulls, like really intense stuff. We have a senior lawyer at Citibank. We have a head of business innovation at a company that covers most of the UK. Like all these women are kicking ass, and outwardly they have a very successful, responsible, well remunerated life. But often they're having to negate or numb out their emotional landscape, their spiritual reality, their hope, their witchiness, if you like, their love of nature, their need to grieve, their need to connect deeply, their need to share, all of the other things that are not met by the job. And coming together in this journey, they're all doing that, and they're masterful, and it's just extraordinary. So each one individually came to me with a kind of secret, like, I know that I'm in this corporate job, but I'm a shaman. One said, I can't say the shaman word out loud, but I'm a shaman. Like, you're in. Brilliant. Another one who's, I'm not going to say which one's which, but, incredibly senior, has been on a whole tantric journey, has explored her own spirituality through sexuality. It's just extraordinary, the way that they can bridge both. And what I'm noticing is there is an increasing awareness and openness to what I'm loosely going to term the feminine, without it being gendered exactly, versus the masculine. The feminine needing and taking up space in a way that has not been allowed before. And that, I think, is really exciting, because when you start to get female leaders who have the capacity and the permission to voice the complexity of what they're bringing, and that is then held by everybody, and other people go, actually, I'm struggling with mental health. I need some more emotionally open conversations. Or I actually have dreams of having a different kind of work-life balance. Or I have a creative project that I'd like to bring into the world. There's suddenly a language where that is not seen as failure, but is actually incorporated into a more human way of being at work, which I'm guessing is kind of closer to the terrain that you are traversing. I don't know. Is that true? I don't know.
Let's talk about that. So I recognize the need for ritual in work. And a lot of the rituals that you're talking about are very big rituals. They're like, life event rituals. And some of those do happen in work. But there's a lot of them that are smaller. And one that comes to mind for me was an accidental ritual, which is that my team and I had worked full time on a project for a year. And that project, there'd been a change in leadership and that project was canceled before we got to finish it. We were devastated by that. We were lucky to have a week where we could go away and we could do a postmortem on the project. So we did that. And I took everybody to my family house down in San Diego. One of the things we did is we walked down the canyon and I took everybody spearfishing. Really not a very corporate event in retrospect. That's probably not what they would have wanted me to do because it was kind of dangerous. But one of the team members speared a stingray. Now, these are not officially edible. I mean, these are not things that you like go out of your way to eat. But we took it back up the canyon. And somewhere on the way during the walk up the canyon, people started referring to it as like the project. And we cooked it and we ate it. And it was really weird, but it made people feel like we had done something that was momentous. I guess what I want to say is that there are things that happen at work where you need to feel the transformation. I mean, another example is when somebody gets laid off. Somebody who's a friend, who's a teammate, and all of a sudden you either could not talk about it, which is usually what happens. There's just very, very little talk about it. Or there could be a ritual where you actually recognize the fact that this is a loss and that this is something that you need to grieve over and memorialize. And so I can think of all these different places where there's an emotional need for ritual at work. And I think we need somebody with the job title, and maybe it's a lot of people with the job title of keeper of the rituals. So what I want to ask you about is, first of all, what do you see in terms of little rituals or smaller rituals that might incorporate with work? And then I want to ask, what is the job role of the keeper of the rituals?
Can I just say how much I love the fact that you did the stingray thing and that you ate it? I mean, I'm sure it wasn't particularly palatable, but I love the commitment to the journey that you went through. And that is a brilliant expression. And hats off to you for going full out into like death and death and consumption of the distasteful thing. It's a really brilliant development of something I heard about, but I've never done, which is a funeral for a bad idea. Not that this was a bad idea. Clearly, it was a good idea. It was an idea that just never got to be taken to fruition. So rituals for work, one very simple one, which is, I think, I've done it quite a lot with corporate clients. It's a very easy one to do, is to reflect on the moments that you have shared over the previous 12 months or quarter even. So rather than a quarterly return just being about measurable metrics that are the usual ones that you would put into a report, rather than that, create better questions around what it is that you want to reflect upon. And do a process that is around, for example, what were the moments of connection that you experienced in the last year? Like, what was the most memorable conversation? What was the best hug? What was a realization of something that you didn't have before? What was a moment of humanity? What was a moment of failure? What was a moment of joy? What was a moment of delight? What was a moment, like basically changing the measurement that you're using to look back on the lived experience to one that has meaning and is confined within a moment. You can do it within work. You can do it with your life as well. So to have people reflect on their lived experience with their own set of metrics that are to do with meaning making as opposed to measurable outcomes. And when you're looking forward within an organization, rather than using the usual metrics to look forward, use those metrics also when looking forward. Like, so how can we create more moments of meaning? How can we create more delight? How can we create more beautiful failures? Like deliberately choosing questions, lenses, if you like, through which to view the way that we work together in order to come back to the things that are actually meaningful and memorable, which won't necessarily pertain to profit and loss. Maybe they will. There may be an aspect of it that is really powerful to be able to engage in the financial health of an organization. But my guess is that gets a lot of airtime. And what doesn't get so much airtime is, for example, did I have a really important memorial service for the end of this team or for this person leaving? Did we have a living funeral? Which is something I've never done, but I know people that do have living funerals because we're all going to have one someday. So you can have a living funeral where you get to have all of the things that you would miss out on because you're the one person who's not there, to bring that into a work context and a way of appreciating somebody. So There's a lovely one where you can draw, again, I've done this within organizations where you get individual maps being made by literally drawing a timeline. And along that timeline, you get people to emote around struggles, triumphs, personal losses, personal gains, moments of joy, moments of connection, moments of realness, whatever the things are that we live through. And then they draw them. And then you basically make a map where everybody's lines you get a big roll of paper and you lay it out on the floor and you spend an hour or so mapping your lived experience. I did this with an organization right after COVID. They'd all been working separately for the last 2 years. They'd all gone through really big stuff because we do. And then they each made their own timeline. And then they walked around and explored each other's timelines and began to explore where they coalesced. And to go, oh, your father died in COVID too. Ah, you left this place and you moved city. So did I, and you start to connect with the humanness that unites everybody underneath the professional identity. And you start to create a map of lived experience that means that people are bonded in a way that is completely different than if they're just staying in the realm of this upper echelon of the most obvious professionalized lived experience. So that's an example. That's kind of low-hanging fruit. That's a universal one. Anyone can do that. In terms of what is the role of the keeper of the ritual of an organization, my guess is that it's to actively engage with the hidden, the liminal, the soulful, the emotional, the stuff that is around the cycles of life and death, the stuff that is going on with us all underneath the surface all the time, our own emotional, mental, physical stuff that is happening, to make a space for those things to be aired and expressed and honored and shared and allowed. I ran this not-for-profit years ago. It's no longer in existence. But when I set it up, it was the first time that I was in charge of a team. And the team had to deliver experiences that were very, very precise in terms of they were around children and parents who were sometimes in quite vulnerable states, stepping into playfulness in nature. And there was a lot of risk involved. We encouraged risk-taking. We encouraged tree climbing and fire making and den destroying and pillow fights and kids going off and playing hide and seek and therefore potentially being hard to find. There was a lot of edges which we were actively embracing people going into. And in order to do it without accident or, lawsuits or whatever, the team had to be incredibly on it, but not just effective, but heart connected. We had to have a Jedi mind trick going on. So I created a ritual for the team over the course of the life of the thing. And I now do it every time I'm working with a team myself, meaning whenever I have somebody working with me on something of mine. I don't necessarily introduce this to all of my clients, but this is how it works. You start with a check-in. And the check-in is where one person at a time speaks uninterrupted for a timed duration. Ideally, as long as 5 minutes, sometimes more. It's quite long. And that check-in is designed to be absolutely anything that is going on for that person, whatever is present, whatever is holding them back from being fully present in the world of the work that they're about to do. So it could be my grandmother's sick and I'm really stressed about it, or my kid is having a tough time at school and I'm just really aware that the school might be calling me any minute, or I've just fallen in love and I can't stop thinking about this person, or I've got a tummy bug. Like anything is fine. It doesn't have to be work related, but airing whatever is holding you back from being present. So everybody gets to do that. And there's no feedback. There's no chat. There's no, oh, my grandmother's dead too. Like, no, you just end up fully listening. And then when everybody's been, then you turn your attention to the work that you're about to engage in. So you go, okay, this is what's happening today. And this is what's going to happen then. And this is really important. Who's on this and who's on that? You have a kind of work focused bit. And then you meditate as a group. And you meditate as a group where each one of you calls in whatever resources you need internally. You connect as a group in terms of sharing those resources in a very particular visualization, which I would lead. And then you expand that sense of resourced energy to encompass the entire day, the entire space, and you let the space be kind of suffused by everybody's positive intention and full presence. Then everybody would go out and spend a minute or two on their own, just grounding it, and then you'd start the day's work. It's a hugely time-consuming thing. It obviously was only because the nature of the work we were doing was so particularly in this kind of vein. We had to be that connected and that present. But it meant that as soon as we went into the day, you could communicate an entire complex piece of information with one look. Literally, there would be kind of almost like a jazz band. You just raise your left eyebrow and that means go back to the first verse. It's like you didn't need words. We were so attuned that we were Jedis in this space where everything flowed. And we'd have a little reset, like a 5-minute version of that at break time. And then at the end of the weekend, do the same thing in reverse. We'd have an untimed spaciousness to debrief, like your Stingray week, but we'd just take a couple of hours over it. And I have never had a team like it. These people were so extraordinary and so loving and so generous, and everybody got what they needed and everybody held everybody else. And it was a profound lesson. And that for me is a ritual.
That's super interesting. My team invented a ritual like that. One of my teams did. We called it Unpacking. And it was before an offsite. We'd get together and we'd say, what's the thing that's on your mind? And the first time we did it, it was not very intimate. It was, well, I've got some, a bill or something that I need to pay. But then we did it a bunch of different times for different offsites, and it got more and more deep. Closest team emotionally I've ever been on was that team. Really, really close. And, a part of my thesis is that work is a product that needs to be designed. And I use that word sort of broadly, which is that it also includes experiences and transformations. Now that I've talked to Joe Pine on the show, and he pointed out that it's product, and then there's services, then there's experience, and then there's transformations in terms of the economy. I realize that managers are designers in that model, that managers are actually ritual keepers. Keepers might be the right word because the team can come up with its own rituals, but sometimes the manager might be a ritual designer. And I was thinking about it overnight, and I was thinking about all the missed opportunities that I have had to actually build ritual into work. An example is oftentimes we finish projects, a team member finishes a project, and it feels like there's no moment. It just happened, and we don't sit down and have some sort of celebration to say that this has happened. Because this is a big deal. These are big, hard things to do, and you don't want to just sort of walk out of them like nothing happened. And so I was thinking it would be fabulous if we planted a tree at the end of major projects, right? And so then over time, what we'd have, we've done 90 projects on my current team, 100 projects, and 99% of them finished successfully, which is crazy. But we'd have 100 trees right now, and there'd be this physical manifestation of something that can be sort of ephemeral. And so I do want to talk for a second about what's the role of objects in ritual. Because one of the things I see you doing in your work is imbuing them with meaning that they wouldn't otherwise have, and then using the object and the meaning attached to it to get something spiritual done.
I love the idea of you planting a tree. Can I just say, I think that is an idea worth pursuing and sharing, because you'd have a forest and then you'd sit in your forest of ideas. And then maybe if you planted fruit trees, you'd eat of the fruit of your idea. I mean, you could have hammocks, you could have tree houses, but I just think it's the most beautiful idea. And yes, the physicality of ritual objects is a really interesting thing. There's a whole area in the British Museum in London, which is a room dedicated to artifacts that have ritualistic meaning in different cultures to do with healing. So there's like a Colombian gold bird that is used in ayahuasca ceremonies that is believed to somehow hold the spirit of the ceremony. Or there's a tunic made of shells from Papua New Guinea that somebody who's in grieving wears for a year. It's heavy, it's physically heavy, and it's designed to hold the heaviness of their grief, and then they take it off after a year. Humans always have made objects that they imbue with meaning. I mean, we have many, many, many objects that we make meaningful in all sorts of different ways, but to make them sacred is to deliberately imbue them with some kind of quality that obviously you could argue is purely your imagination, and that's okay. I mean, I have an altar. I live on a boat, which, by the way, is an object I have imbued with enormous amounts of meaning. My boat is a person, as far as I'm concerned, and she's my friend. She is not an inanimate object. She has a very particular quality and energy, and she helps me in the work I do. I know I'm sounding slightly insane, and anthropomorphizing her to this degree, but honestly, she is an object which holds a quality of presence and peace that actually shifts people when they come in. So objects have often been imbued with meaning by virtue of the craftsmen who've made them, the people who have then turned them into something that is of import. And then there's layers and layers of repeated use that mean other people have the same association with the things. And suddenly the object itself takes on this other aspect simply by the lens through which it's seen. So the downside of that, and with a ritual in general, is rituals can become hollow because they become simply about the repeated association and not about the actual power within the thing. There's a story which I was told once, which I love, which was there's some meditation master who was teaching his disciples to meditate, and the room that they sat in was partly indoors and partly outdoors. So it was sheltered, but it was open to the outside. And there was a cat who lived in the monastery who kept coming in and bothering the people meditating. So the master said, we have to tie the cat up when it's time to meditate. So they put a stick in the ground and they put a long lead of rope and they tied it around the cat's neck, and meditation time would begin when the cat was tied to the rope. Eventually the cat dies and the cat is replaced by another cat, and the cat number 2 is replaced. But also has the same thing. Eventually the master dies. But now they cannot meditate unless there is a cat tied to a rope. So the downside of over investing objects with meaning is that you then make it about the object and not about the thing that it was supposed to denote in the first place. And religion, which is often such a powerful vessel for meaning making, can often be so far removed from the original energy that infused it that it becomes about the repetition over and above the original spark. So on one hand, anything can be ritualized and turned into meaningful things, including the objects on my altar, which I put tons of meaning by because they're chosen by me to be in a place of power. But equally, all of this is a choice. I believe that we are meaning-making machines. We are going to go around making things meaningful. And my gift is to say, well, let's harness that and utilize it and make it powerful and interesting and useful and serve human connection and purpose and beauty and love and better ideas and greater imagination. But that same function of meaning being imposed on something, that can be turned to any end. We can become superstitious. We can become paranoid. We can turn meaning against ourselves. And so in terms of the objects that we can utilize to make, a talking stick is a great one, for example. We're not using one today, but we could be actually, given that we have to physically pass the mic back and forth between us. A talking stick would be a really useful object. I would love there to have been a talking stick in my family when I was growing up. It's a really useful vessel to denote deep listening and awareness about interruption. It's a physical object. Anything can be a talking stick. But once you have a talking stick that has been used as the talking stick for 10 years, it's going to have the weight of all sorts of conversations in its bones, if you like, that will then infuse it. So you're going to be more likely to respect it. Joseph Campbell said something really interesting about this. There's a quote where apparently he said, if you want to make anything sacred, you just draw a circle around it. Like he literally apparently took his watch off, put it on a piece of paper, drew a physical circle around the watch and said, there, I've just made my watch into a sacred object. And although I think there's more to it than that, there is something very powerful around then suddenly you're turning it into a spaciousness that has a different quality of air around it, a different kind of awe or regard based around this circle that we can put around our lived experiences and around the objects that inform those experiences. I also think there's something about understanding that the meaning that we make is often ours and not necessarily instantly recognizable to all. Like after my father died, I had to clear his apartment, and he lived to an old age. He'd done a lot of traveling. He'd collected a lot of objects, many of which I had no idea about. So I had to make this awful decision to get rid of stuff that I knew had meaning. But because it wasn't my meaning, I chose not to keep it. Because if it wasn't meaningful, I couldn't house something because it was meaningful to him when that story hadn't been imparted. it also separates out the physical from the meaningful. And the stories that we ascribe to things, the meaning that we make of things, is where the ritual inhabits. So again, back to the ritual at work possibility, the job of the ritual keeper could be to keep exploring and defining and mining the myth of the organization, the cultural foundation upon which we all gather.
That ties in incredibly well to one of the earlier interviews I did with John Truby. He's a script doctor, a script writer, and he wrote the book, The Anatomy of Genres. And one of the things that he spoke about in The Anatomy of Genres was the beats of a story, and that different stories have different beats. And one of the places where we might need ritual is a place where there's supposed to be a beat, but the environment is not going to give us the beat that we need to feel that part of the story has happened. And so that's a beautiful connection between these two different discussions, which is this creation of beats. For a manager, as the keeper of rituals, a part of it is recognizing when a beat is missing, when there's a beat that needs to be hit, that's going to make that story work. It's a beautiful idea.
So in the keynote here, Joe Pine, who is the godfather of experience design, spoke about the facility that he went to when he had to have a corneal transplant. So he spoke about this amazing place in America, South Dakota, I think it was, which was designed in this extraordinary way to facilitate the healing process for the patient and the efficacy of the whole medical procedure. But what he didn't say, and this is where it calls out the piece that I inhabit, is the ritual aspect that is also possible when it comes to organ transplants, which I know sounds a bit crazy, but basically, I was asked a few years ago by Moorfields Eye Hospital in London to create a ritual for the families of the people who had died and whose eyes had been donated to meet the people who could now see as a result. This is a completely 21st century ritual situation. There has never before been enough people, a critical mass of people whose sight has been restored as a result of people donating the eyes of their loved ones, which, by the way, is the most intense organ donation to do. Like, the woman who has to ask that question was part of the design process. Her job is to go to the recently bereaved while the dead person is in the other room and say, I'm really sorry to have to ask you this, but would you be willing to donate the eyes of your loved one at a moment when they've just lost them? And some people say yes. And enough people say yes that people in the world can now see, which is a sacrifice which is pretty bizarre to even consider. But when you think about the fact that enough people have said yes, enough people can see, and yet there's no emotional holding for that part of the transaction, for that gift, and then for somebody who's lost a loved one to look into the eyes of somebody else, knowing that they're seeing the eyes or a part of the eyes of the person that they loved, that is something that requires a container for the emotion and the reflection and the transition and the gift and the gratitude from the person who can now see, and an honoring of the life of the person who died and gave them their eyes. It's mind-blowing to me. And that right there, to me, shows the space that the ritual design inhabits versus all of the other bits of the experience designs. Everything to do with how the space feels and how the flow of the medical process goes. That's all the normal stuff that design processes would address. But the ritual piece is the other piece. And actually, that brings me on to something I wanted to mention, which I haven't, which is the misuse of the word ritual, which is endemic, which is to denote repeated behavior. And what it misses is the soulfulness. So there are many articles saying my morning rituals are to write stream of consciousness and have a cup of coffee, or to have a shower or go for a morning run. And those are routines. The difference is they are like the design of the hospital versus the ritual for the eyes. And so the difference is between going for a hike and going on a pilgrimage. The difference is to do with the invisible aspect, the meaning making, the invoking of something bigger, the emotional transition, maybe the sacrifice, maybe the celebration, all of the things that don't just go with the mechanical aspect of walking. And it's the one piece that I have a bugbear about, because I see brands using the word ritual in a way that is just around repeated behavior being correlated with a particular product and wanting to build brand loyalty, which is understandable, to make that particular thing mean something to the person. They call that a ritual. But that doesn't do the thing that my teacher said, which is that it nourishes the soul. If it doesn't nourish the soul, it's a routine. And it's my bugbear, but I'm going to keep shouting it from the rooftops that a ritual is a ritual when it moves the heart, when it has something deeper and wiser to impart, not just a repeated behavior.
So I'm going to ask some closing questions, which I always ask. And the first one is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? Your job hires you to do something for it. What do you hire it to do for you?
That's such a weird and interesting and brilliant question. So I'm going to answer it in a slightly oblique way. I relate to my job and my business, my company, as if it were a sentient being with whom I am collaborating. I'm not even slightly exaggerating. Like there's a whole meditation I developed where you get to meet your idea, and that idea then presents itself to you in whatever form it wants to. The meditation that I use with my clients when they're bringing a project into the world or working with a business or writing a book or making a podcast or whatever, that meditation I do myself. So when I do it for myself, I connect with the essence of what it is that I'm here to do. And that thing communicates with me. So I've figured out a way of talking to it. And we have conversations sometimes. And in a guided meditation, it's structured. It's a 25-minute thing. And I sit down and I welcome it into the space. And then we've figured out how to communicate. And I listen to it. And it allows me, it has many gifts for me, but it allows me to structure my life with beats, to use your language. I have learned that for me to do what I need to do, I need to be rested. I need to have my own daily practice, which has a ritual aspect to it. I need to work with the flow of my peaks and troughs of energy. I need to make sure that the people I'm working with are a fit for the kind of conversations that we're going to be having. And I'm not going to terrify them. There's a whole process of connecting from the heart with everybody who I work with. And if they don't want to, that's cool. Then I'll send them to other people who work in a slightly different way, to create a physical space that feels harmonious and calm, to give myself risks that I need to take that push me out of my comfort zone sometimes, to seek out collaboration with people who have complementary but different skill sets that could harmonize with mine, to find playmates. And the beat finding, if you like, I'm going to just use that now, the beat finding and also the honoring of the multifarious aspects of what's going on. Because it's not like I make widgets. Do you know what I mean? Everything I do is bespoke. Every client I work with gets a different thing. There are certain things that can be replicated, but the beat aspect is one commonality that goes through. So I become my own client. I have my own rituals, my own ritual design, my own way of invoking, my own ideation processes. All of the things that I bring to others, I have to do myself. When I was running that not-for-profit about parents and kids, I had to play. It would have been entirely wrong if I was not playful, because the whole thing was about play. So I had to bake in playtime in order for me to be able to meet a 6-year-old where they were at. Otherwise, I would be like, but you're just distracted with silly thing. You know what I mean? I had to embody it myself. And with this stuff, I have to be daily connected with my own wisdom and wonder and beats and how it fits in a bigger arc of the story, the myth that I'm living into. So I have to take my own medicine. Otherwise, I couldn't possibly do what I do, which means I have a very unusual work life. I do not work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. I do not always work in one place. I'm lucky in that my intuition is strong and I'm able to follow sparkly paths and I'm able to meander through the world and connect in ways that are very unusual. So what I do is also how I do what I do, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's a new answer. It's a new answer. And you're particularly aware of how your work creates beats for you because in your story, because of the nature of your work. Yeah, that's great. What does your work cost you?
I have never chosen security. I have always chosen freedom and creativity. So my work costs me foundational, solid security roots. It costs me a team often. I mean, I have had teams, but like mostly it's just me making this up on my own, like figuring it out, hacking my way through the undergrowth, carving a path into the unknown. There aren't very many ritual designers out there. There are now a couple. We do exist. I am not the only one, but it's a comparatively new field, and I've been doing it quite a long time. So for a long time, it's cost me any sort of recognition. Making the argument that people need me takes a while. So thanks for giving me a while. So yeah, it costs me security, financial security, job security, knowing that the right clients are going to show up. Like, I just don't ever know, but I trust. I'm also very grateful that I tend not to have to do stuff that is too far off piste anymore. I tend to be more or less aligned. Everything that I do is with heart and soul and an integrity, and that's wonderful. But it does cost me knowing how much money I'm going to make next year, or knowing that I would love there to be more security. It also costs me sometimes, because I'm making it up, I have to be all of the things. I have to be my own web designer and copywriter and accountant. And, I do hire people, but I'm basically doing a lot of it myself. And I don't mind that. But sometimes it would be, I have an assistant, I have people who work with me on the tech, and I do have an accountant, I do have it. But the reality is it's kind of me. And it costs me thinking out loud with people, because I don't have any peers really who I can do this with. There's nobody doing anything quite close enough to what I do to be able to share identical work concerns.
That is the cost of being on a frontier, is that you get out there alone. I also think it's fascinating that your first metaphor for what it costs you is that your feet are not on the ground. And then you live on a boat. It's the perfect sort of objective correlative, sort of thing in a story. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
So there's a ton of stuff on my website. My name is Tiu De Haan, TIUDEHAAN.com. There's masses there. There's a whole Explore tab, which has tons of video, lots of podcasts I've been on, articles that I've either been interviewed in or written myself. And there's a TED Talk, which is a very personal answer to the very first question, which is how I got into this, which is basically to do with my mother and her death. But the website has tons of stuff. I don't use Twitter. I'm pretty active on Instagram. But yeah, my website really, I suppose, is the place. There's hours and hours and hours of content there if you're interested.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really opened my eyes to a way of looking at the experience of work that I hadn't thought about before. So I really appreciate it. I think it's filling in a real gap in sort of the catalog that we're building here on the podcast of different ways of looking at work.
Thank you. It is such a joy. And it's been so wonderful to meet you as well. We've just had such a ball. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.